Sonic, the heart of your system.
Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and today we are back with another RX 5600 XT review. This particular card here is from Gigabyte, and it is the Gaming OC6G. So just before we dive into the review itself, obviously the 5600 XT has had a somewhat messy launch, I think it is fair to say. I just want to say I'm not really going to be addressing the whole BIOS debacle again in this video. I kind of went over all of that and all my thoughts on the whole BIOS situation. So if you do want to hear my thoughts on that, I'm going to leave a link in the description to our launch day review. But here I really am just going to focus on this Gigabyte card. So being a factory OC model, it's actually Gigabyte's flagship card. This did get the updated BIOS, so it does now have 14 gigabits per second memory, and it also has a 1750 megahertz boost clock. So in this review, we're going to be looking at the card's performance, how well does it compare to the Sapphire Pulse, for instance, and we'll also focus on the thermals and also the acoustic testing as well. Just before we get into all of that testing though, it is worth looking at the overall design of the card. So we have seen a number of Nvidia based Gigabyte cards come out over the last year or so, and overall the design here is basically the same sort of thing. So it's got a relatively plain looking black plastic shroud, which does have a few grey accents on there. I wouldn't say it's the most exciting thing to look at, but the upside of that is it is very colour neutral, so you will have no issues putting this in a colour match build. We can also see that this is Gigabyte's Windforce 3X cooler, so obviously triple fans, each fan measures 80mm, and as we've seen with previous Gigabyte cards in the past, the middle fan does actually spin in reverse, so Gigabyte says this should help reduce general turbulence and thus improve airflow pressure down onto the heatsink itself, but obviously we will look at our thermal testing later on. In terms of the overall size of the card as well, by modern standards it's not really that big. It measures in at 279.85 by 114.35 by 49.55 millimeters. So like I said, not a huge card. It may cause some issues for those with particularly small ITX chassis due to its length, around 28 centimeters long, and it is slightly thicker than a standard dual slot card, but by and large, anyone who has a standard ATX case should probably be fine with this model. Moving around to the front side of the card now, here we can see another grey section on the shroud, which is home to the Gigabyte logo, and this is actually the only RGB zone on the card itself. You can control the RGB here using Gigabyte's Aorus Engine software. As it is only one small logo, it's not really the most flashy RGB implementation I've seen, but it does give you the ability to add a touch of colour to the card should you wish. But obviously if you just don't want any RGB, you can of course turn it off. Flipping over, we can also see a full-length backplate. There's no cutouts there whatsoever, just a few screws. And it is good to see that this is a metal backplate, so it does feel reassuringly sturdy. It also feels nice and premium to the touch. Apart from that simple white Gigabyte logo as well, it is just plain black, so it's not even, there's no brush finish or anything like that, just a plain black backplate. Personally, I do quite like this simple styling, but again, that is all going to be personal preference. Other things to note just before moving on to the PCB include the single 8-pin PCI power connector, and we can also get a look at the video outputs, where this card offers 3 display ports and then 1 HDMI. To get to that PCB which we just mentioned, you need to remove 7 screws from the back of the card, and then we can get a look at the board itself. It looks to me that Gigabyte is clearly reusing the PCB from its 5700 series. There's a few kind of empty spaces for extra inductors and memory chips, but we can also see that Gigabyte has gone for a 5-phase VRM for the GPU, while it's a single phase for the memory. Speaking of the memory, these are the D9 WCW modules from Micron, so they are rated at 14 gigabits per second. As we've already discussed in our launch day review, initially these chips were meant to run at 12 gigabits per second, but now with the new updated BIOS, which this Gigabyte card does have, they are now running back up at 14 gigabits per second. Finally, as for the cooler, this is comprised of 3 separate fin stacks, each connected by 5 6mm copper heat pipes. These heat pipes make direct contact with the GPU die, but we can see a separate cold plate for the memory modules just around that contact area, and off to the side there is another cold plate for the MOSFETs as well. So that is really it for our look at the overall design of the card and its cooler, and we're now going to move straight on to our thermal testing. Here, 2 things do stand out to me. The first is the particularly low GPU edge temperature of just 67 degrees for the Gigabyte gaming OC. That actually makes it 7 degrees cooler than the Sapphire Pulse using this edge temperature metric. So it is definitely showing the benefit of the gaming OC's 2 extra heat pipes compared to the Pulse, which only has 3 heat pipes. The second point, however, though, is that the Gigabyte Gaming OC does actually have slightly warmer memory temperature. There we saw a peak figure of 82 degrees, which actually makes the memory about 8 degrees hotter than the Sapphire Pulse. While this is still well within spec, so therefore I'm not really that concerned about the temperature, it does just go to show that Sapphire clearly has a slightly more sophisticated and more effective memory cooling solution than the gaming OC. As for the noise levels of this card now, Gigabyte has again produced a very quiet running card. We saw less than 39 decibels recorded on our sound meter when the card was under load, so very, very quiet. Just to give you a bit more context as well, that was when the fans were spinning at around 31%, which was very consistent through our testing. 31%, which is around 1320 RPM. So really, by the time this card is actually installed in a case, it's just going to be very difficult to hear. Again, comparing this to the Pulse, there's hardly any difference between the two in terms of overall noise levels, as they are both very quiet cards. Now we're also going to move on to look at power draw. Here specifically we're looking at total system power draw, and once more there is really nothing between our two 5600 XT cards, with our meter reading around the 255 watt mark for both cards. This means that power draw is essentially the same as the RTX 2060 Super from Nvidia, but it is still significantly less than the older RX Vega 56 GPU. Now we are going to move on to our gaming testing, but just before we do, I think it is worth pointing out that RX 5600 XT cards, like the Sapphire Pulse and this Gigabyte Gaming OC, those 5600 XT cards which have received the updated BIOS, giving them 14 gigabits per second memory, I think they're all going to perform basically exactly the same. That's because from all the cards I've seen online that have 14 gigabits per second memory, they all have the same 1750 megahertz boost clock as well. So I wonder if that's maybe just a maximum clock speed limit set by AMD. I tried reaching out to AMD to confirm this, haven't heard back at the time of filming. But basically, what I'm trying to say is, if you see a 5600 XT that has received the BIOS update, it has 14 gigabit per second memory, it should also have 1750 megahertz boost clock for the GPU core. That also goes for both the Pulse and the Gaming OC, so really we shouldn't see much of a difference at all between those two cards. To illustrate this, we do look at average clock speed under load, and here we saw just a 12 megahertz difference between the Pulse and the Gaming OC, which is less than 1%. So basically, if you know how well the Pulse performs in one game, the Gaming OC is going to be functionally identical. For the purposes of this review, that does mean we're not going to go through all 11 of our games again, but of course do head over to kitguru.net. We do have all of those charts up there in written form if you do want to see how the card performs in a particular title. We'll just dive into some games now though, and we will start with Battlefield 5 at 1080p. And here we can see the Gigabyte 5600 XT comes in about 5% faster than the RTX 2060, producing just over 100 frames per second. This does make it though still 6% slower than the RTX 2060 Super. Meanwhile, the difference between both the 5600 XT cards in our chart is less than a single frame. At 1440p, these differences don't change, so the Gigabyte card is still 5% faster than the 2060, but 6% slower than the 2060 Super, and it is again also functionally identical to the Sapphire Pulse 5600 XT. Gears 5 now is another strong game for AMD, and at 1080p we see a very impressive 12% performance advantage for the Gigabyte gaming OC when compared to Nvidia's RTX 2060. This puts performance of the 5600 XT actually on par with that of the 2060 Super at 1080p resolution. If we bump up the resolution to 1440p, there the RTX 2060 does gain some ground back on the 5600 XT, but the Gigabyte card is still 9% faster. Relative to the 2060 Super, however, the 5600 XT is now 3% slower at this resolution. Those are two positive results for the 5600 XT, but Ghost Recon Breakpoint is a bit tougher for this card. Starting at 1080p, here we do see the gaming OC come in 2% faster than the RTX 2060, but 8% slower than the 2060 Super. Things do look relatively worse at 1440p though, where we see the card actually come in 6% slower than the RTX 2060. Therefore, the 2060 Super is actually 16% faster at 1440p in Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Just for our last game of the day, as we have seen performance basically identical between the both 5600 XTs, we will just move on to Red Dead Redemption 2 using high settings at 1080p. Here we can see the Gigabyte RX 5600 XT outperforming the RTX 2060 by 7%, while it is just 4% slower than the 2060 Super. Again, here the difference between both 5600 XT cards is just 0.7 FPS at this resolution. At 1440p now, the Gigabyte card does stretch its lead over the RTX 2060 to 9%, while it is also just 3% slower than the 2060 Super. Once more, there is no meaningful difference between the gaming OC and the Pulse 5600 XT. So that is really going to do it for our games testing for now. Like we said, we didn't show all of the games we tested simply because performance of the Gigabyte card compared to the Sapphire card is functionally identical. In actual fact, across all 11 games that we tested, average performance difference between the two cards was 0%. So realistically, if you get a 5600 XT with memory clocks at 14 gigabits per second and the GPU boost clock at 1750 megahertz, they're all basically going to perform the same, and that is what we found with this Gigabyte card as well as the Sapphire Pulse. Just before we wrap up this review, we will also touch on manual overclocking. However, there isn't really a whole lot to say here, as once that updated BIOS did come out from AMD, overclocking headroom was basically reduced to nothing. So we could max out the GPU frequency slider in AMD software, we could also max out the memory clock, but that only resulted in a 2% GPU frequency for the card, while memory frequency rose 6%, so not really a whole lot to speak about. And then in the real world, that saw functional performance improvements of around 3% depending on the game. I think the most we saw was 5% in Gears 5, so we're really not looking at much of an overclock at all. But like we said, that is just what happens when the clock speeds have already been overclocked with that new updated BIOS. So then, that is really going to do it for this review, and I think it is safe to say Gigabyte has built a very good card with the Gaming OC 6G. First of all, it is very quiet under load, which I really appreciate, and in terms of gaming performance, it is going to be as fast as any of the other RX 5600 XTs out there. Additionally, temperatures are also nice and low, with the slight exception of the memory temperature, but that is still well within spec and nothing to worry about. The main drawback then for this card is going to be the pricing. So at the time of filming, I haven't actually seen it for sale anywhere, but Gigabyte did tell us that the UK MSRP is £289.99. This makes it £30 more expensive than the Sapphire Pulse, while it is also £20 more expensive than some base model RTX 2060s. 2060 at that price I do think is still quite appealing. It is slightly slower on average, but obviously you're not going to have to deal with any of the BIOS shenanigans, and it does also have ray tracing support, which could be a factor depending on how you view that technology. Overall then, the conclusion is basically quite straightforward for this card. I do rate it, it is a good card. I think it just needs to be about £20 to £30 cheaper. Certainly at the current price, with the Sapphire Pulse performing essentially the same in games, and it's not really that much different in terms of the temperatures and acoustics, At £30 more expensive, the gaming OC does just become a bit hard to justify. So with a price cut, yeah, but right now I think buying the Sapphire Pulse for £30 less is going to be a better option. That's going to do it for this review though, guys. If you liked it, you can toss us a thumbs up. Do let me know your thoughts on this card down below. We're also going to be checking out the MSI Gaming X in our next review. That's going to be a particularly interesting one, as the memory for that card is still clocked at 12 gigabits per second, so we can see exactly what difference that makes. Until then, if you like this t-shirt, you can check out a link to our merch store down below. We'd also love to chat with you guys over on Discord, so you can also find a link for that in our description. And finally, if you would like to back us on Patreon, not only can you get some cool perks like getting some exclusive giveaways, where you can also get access to some of our content early. Until then though, guys, I'm Dominic 4Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.